So I want to address a topic that we really need to consider before we talk about peace talks, and that is what happens if Russia wins and then they keep going. Like, okay, so let's frame it like this. So let's say that we have a peace that is just kind of, forced on Ukraine, and Russia gets to be done. There's a ceasefire. They're not fighting with Ukraine anymore. Russia gets to keep certain oblasts, and Ukraine keeps certain stuff, but Russia's not really punished for this. What does Russia do next? And George Barros of the ISW explains here in an interview with Times Radio, and we're going to unpack some of this, that Russia will redirect its battle-hardened troops to invade the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Like, Estonia is right on the border with Russia. Latvia is the capital city. Vilnius is just 30 miles or less from the border of Belarus. Like, these guys are in danger. He says NATO will bicker internally, splinter, and fail to respond. Let's hear what he has to say, and then just kind of think about what could be coming down the pike if we're not careful.
Heels, of course, is our eastern flank with the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. There is this strategic gap between the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad and Belarus called the Suwalki corridor, and that is, of course, where Poland and Lithuania share a border. And for a long time, it's been an open question about whether or not the Russians have freedom of movement in Belarus, because for a long time, Lukashenko was not a fan of keeping Russian forces for a long time within Belarus, but that's being eroded. We need to start seriously considering the heightened risks that we have that if the Russians manage to deploy large-scale combat forces to Belarus, it makes the doomsday scenario for the defense of the Baltic states a lot less theoretical and a lot more realistic.
Okay, so what we're talking about is the difference between where Kaliningrad is on the Baltic and where the rest of Russia is. And there's Russia, then there's Belarus, and then there is Lithuania on one side and Poland on the other, and then Kaliningrad. And Kaliningrad is a holdover from World War II. It was a German enclave, and the Poles didn't want it because it was not, Poles didn't live there, and Lithuanians didn't want it because Lithuanians didn't live there. And so Russia snatched it up. Okay, that's fine. I mean, they were the victors in World War II, and so nobody was thinking anything about it. But now Russia wants to may want to connect it, and that would be trampling on Poland and or Lithuania in order to connect that strip between Belarus and Kaliningrad.
It has implications. Go ahead.
This is, you say, theoretical at the moment. I mean, what is the risk that this is part of the plan?
I would argue that it is part of the plan. I would argue that I think Putin has objectives for his career. He's an aging dictator, and he's thinking about legacy. And in my assessment, Putin has actually been quite clear about what his objectives are. You can look at his public statements and his speeches, and he often likens himself to previous tsars like Catherine the Great and Alexander the Great. These were empire builders and conquerors. And Catherine the Great annexed Crimea in the 18th century.
And Putin is really potentially considering whether he should be taking Belarus into the fold as one of Russia's oblasts as well. And it's yet to be seen how Lukashenko will deal with that, or will be, if Lukashenko will go along, or if this is after Lukashenko, or just what.
Putin talks about the need to reunite the Ukrainians and the Belarusians with the Russians. He calls actually the three of these peoples one nation, the Russian nation. And these countries as Russia's historical land.
And this is why when you watch Russian TV, like I spend a lot of time watching Russian propaganda, they talk about the Ukrainians not as their own people, but as Russians who have turned on their own country. They're really Russians, but they have this Ukrainian bug in them that's making them act like they're against their own mother Russia. They see themselves, or the propagandists see themselves as one with Belarus, as one with Ukraine, as historic Russian lands.
And what we have here is really interesting. We have a natural experiment where we have the Russian effort to get Ukraine, which he did with naked brute force, and that's not been as effective. And then he has the other effort to get Belarus through subversion, of sort of boiling the frog approach that has been substantially more and frighteningly more effective. And I think once the Russians consolidate what they will have in Belarus and Ukraine, I think Putin's next objective is to humiliate NATO and prove that it's a paper tiger, to prove that NATO, that collective defense actually isn't credible, and that if you fight NATO, you will not have unanimity amongst the NATO members to go defend fellow NATO members.
Okay, let's stop there for a second. So the way that Putin is dealing with Belarus is more in line with what you see in Georgia. In Georgia, they're not firing shots; they're just kind of taking over by a propaganda coup, which turned the election and such, right? In Belarus, 5 years ago, there were protests. There's no protests right now with Lukashenko's fraudulent election. Lukashenko is signing treaties that are making them closer to Russia, and ultimately, Russia probably will try to enfold, if this keeps going down this path, Belarus into Russia.
I'm very concerned in the world in which the Russians, leveraging their military learning and experience from Ukraine, leveraging new preferable geography within Belarus, Putin assesses that the Russian military is basically as ready as it can be, and that they should invade one of the Baltic states, threaten the West with nuclear warfare should they intervene in any sort of meaningful way, and then prove that you might have to fight a war against some of the stalwart members of NATO who will go to war over the Baltic states, but you won't have to be fighting Germans. You won't have to be fighting Hungarians. You won't have to be fighting, Turks, and it certainly won't be a politically unanimous decision.
Right. The Poles will be all in. The Brits and the French will probably be in. But how, a disunited NATO is nothing like a united NATO. And Putin is calling the bluff. And he might be right about that unless we get our act together really, really quick.
And that will then prove that you can then indeed salami slice NATO.
But the counter-argument that people put to that is that fighting the war in Ukraine has exhausted the Russian forces to such an extent that they will have no ambition or at least no ability to go on the offensive anywhere else.
In the short, immediate term, yes. But I'm very concerned about what happens if and when the shooting stops. Of course, we're talking now about ceasefires and negotiations, and President Donald Trump is working on that. But we know that the Russians lose 30 to 45,000 troops per month. And the Russians also generate about 30 to 45,000 troops per month. As soon as the shooting stops.
Yeah, so they've exhausted the forces that exist, but they don't have any problem with luring other young men into the military, training them for a week and sending them into the meat grinder. So they're not worried about it. And there are some commanders that are learning some things about how the battle works. So Ukraine really is, we talk about Ukraine holding back Russia again, and defending all of Europe. This really does look like the scenario that's happening right now.
The Russians will be able to not be at a net loss, but they will be able to rebuild and reconstitute. They'll be able to unplug their forces from Ukraine and internalize a lot of the lessons learned, the things that the Russians actually did so poorly. We talk a lot about the things that the Russians did poorly during this war. They will study that relentlessly. They will learn. They will emerge as a battle-hardened and much more capable force that will be capable of waging operations, I think, a lot quicker than more people realize, and a lot more quickly than I think European states will be able to credibly deter against a very large, battle-hardened, experienced Russian military.
Wow. So we have to think through this now. If you make a terrible deal that just ends the war, just to end the war, what will Russia do next? And I think there's a very great potential that if Russia hasn't lost its ambition because it hasn't been punished, and that's half the battle here, that it could do something else. And if it does something else, at what point do we call its bluff? At what point do we say, stop, you can't do this anymore? And they're calling NATO's bluff by potentially invading a Baltic state or two or three and saying, what are you going to do about it? And they could easily, with the kind of army, the size of the army that they have right now, run all over the Baltics, take over, and then you'd have to dislodge them from the Baltics, effectively destroying the Baltics in the process. I mean, it's just a terrible scenario. The most effective way, as far as I can see, to keep any greater damage is to stop them right now in Ukraine. And Ukraine's doing its part. we need to be doing that too. All right, tell me what you think about that. Put that in the comments below. Thank you for the time, the likes, the shares, and the subscribes, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.